So at the studio with Kitchen Theory, we have Dr. Kate McLean, a designer, researcher, and artist. Now, Kate, I've been fascinated by your work for several years, and because it touches on, I guess, areas of research into the senses that I'm absolutely fascinated by. I can't wait to hear more about your work. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Let's start off by, how would you describe your work to those who aren't familiar with it?
Hello, thank you very much for the welcome and the invite here today. It's an absolute pleasure. The work that I do is really largely concerned with smells and the human perception of those smells in different cities and places around the world. And what started as really just a curiosity has turned into what is now 14-year project, which has been quite amazing and quite a journey along the way. What I do is I take smell perceptions from people in cities around the world and translate those into visuals that I then map onto the cities themselves. So I create what I call smell maps. And those are really the records of the scents, whiffs, odours that exist and in a moment in time in a particular place.
So are we talking about kind of smell maps of cities? Is it of specific places? How do you decide on how to smell map a location?
It's quite an organic process, as really befits the subject matter. Usually where it started was in Edinburgh, and I was doing an MFA at Edinburgh College of Art. And I was really interested in all of the different senses and how we might map those experiences onto a plan view of the city. And the smell one it developed its own range and just its own scale, because some of the most interesting smells that people associated with Edinburgh were things like the penguins at the zoo, down to the North Sea, including sort of like the cherry blossom in the parks, and then the sort of like the greens and the fish and chip shops. And so that actually delineated its own geography. And so the scale of the Edinburgh map is sort of like quite a wide area. It covers probably about 5-6 miles across it. But I've done other projects where it's just been a single city block in New York. So their scale is determined really by the people that I interact with and what they describe.
It's interesting because I find that smell is, in general, I'd say maybe there's been a bit of a different shift now because of COVID, but generally our sense of smell is probably one of the most underrated senses that we have. I remember reading a piece of research that asked people if they had to lose one of their senses, what would it be? And smell was really high up on that list. But I think once most people understand how important their sense of smell is in relation to their perceptions of flavor, that all of a sudden they realize that, well, if I lose my sense of smell, I no longer get to enjoy food and drinks and social occasions. And there's a whole host of other issues that go around with not having a sense of smell. So when it comes to cities, how aware are we of these different aromas? Do we take it for granted? Are people surprised by this?
I still think it's a sense that people undervalue. Despite a huge amount of sort of artistic, scientific research that's gone into it in recent years, from sort of like a variety of areas, from sort of like history to urban planning to art and design research, and to the psychology of it as well. I think it's underrated because until COVID, as you say, we didn't really recognise how important smell was to flavour in particular, but also to our perception of the people that are around us. And people equally matter as much as food, and not being able to sense people that we loved through our noses became sort of like something that a number of people became aware of. But I feel now that it's probably disappeared off the sort of like the cliff edge again, and it's no longer to the forefront. And I think what I'm trying to do with my work is just constantly sort of like get those perceptions up there again, and really try to encourage people just to make smell a small part of their everyday experience. even to just go outside their front door and say, okay, I'm going to smell this here and now, and here's what I understand. And if I can just give you an example, walking down here today, I got to a street corner. Before I turned that corner, I could smell in one sniff, it was garlic. I think there was something like some jasmine or some really heady sort of like blossom, but there was also arc welding. And that sort of complexity of realizing what those things were without being able to see any of them is the singular power of smell.
Do you feel that your personal sense of smell has been honed? Because the way you just described that, I'm thinking I've turned plenty of street corners around London and I've never smelt those very specific kind of aromas. Maybe in certain areas there are certain aromas that really kind of stand out to me. But do you feel that your own sense of smell is, if not been heightened, but is more acutely aware of the aromatic environment that you're in?
I think it does depend on what I'm doing. So on an everyday basis, unless I actually tune into it, no. But then I have become a witness to so many people's very lyrical and very beautiful descriptions of smells that I start to be able to frame it better when I'm focused on it. So I don't think it's a sense that comes naturally to anybody, and it doesn't really come naturally to me either. I do have to think about it first, and then when I'm aware of it, and if there's something particularly strong that comes through that is possibly a little bit incongruous, that I'm not expecting it, that for me then becomes the trigger to say, oh, I wonder what that is.
And I guess just as you were talking about it, you mentioned about kind of the psychology of smell. And I was thinking that I guess and you also mentioned about familiarity with others, because I remember speaking with, it was a physician, and we were talking about the sense of smell in relation to flavor perception. They said, oh, well, it's also really important in terms of bonding and mating and finding a partner, and that those, the complexities of one's body odor also kind of play such an important role. And I was thinking about how this links as well to that idea of nostalgia. And there are certain places you can go that, let's say, I don't know, your grandma's home, that have a certain aroma to them that becomes emotionally evocative in some way. Is that something that we take, again, for granted in our homes, in our workplace, in our day-to-day life?
Very much so. What you've just asked there is a huge, great, multifaceted question, because there's a couple of things that crop up there. One is the idea of habituation, and that means that we get used to what our own homes smell like and we stop noticing it. And other people walk into our spaces and they can actually detect those smells, whereas we are impervious to it because we have got used to those smells. So it's always really interesting to sort of like go away from home, come back again after a holiday and actually smell what your own home smells like. In terms of relating that sort of like nostalgically, especially to other people, I think that almost anyone could remember going into a grandparent's home and smelling something very distinct. For me, it was very much my grandfather's shed and garden shed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You just say those words with smell, and it quite often gets a great response in people, but suddenly go, oh yeah, there was that, and that. And there's all these complex different things that come into the smell of a garden shed.
At the moment I smell that damp, dank garden shed aroma, it takes me back to being about 3 or 4 and playing in my grandparents' garden. Yeah.
And I mean, even though if you might add a bit of creosote or stuff on there, a bit of the lawnmower that's still got some cut grass on it. There may be paint tins stored in there with sort of a paint remover, and sort of, as you say, the damp earth. And you put all of those together and you've got something truly, truly magical.
Talking about damp earth, so on one of our dishes, that we've had various iterations of over the years. So the dish is called Flavors of the Earth, and it's really about celebrating seasonal produce and celebrating as well our kind of that human appreciation for being in the great outdoors. And interestingly, there's even research that suggests that whether it's digital nature or real nature, that there's a beneficial kind of impact that has on one's psychological well-being. And as part of this dish, we have the projections of the forest floor on the table. We have green lighting. We have the sounds of the great outdoors playing in the background. There's a mist in the air. And then once the dish is served, we activate dry ice on the table that delivers the aroma of geosmin. Is it geosmin?
Geosmin is how I
Geosmin, yeah.
describe it.
That delivers that geosmin aroma that kind of blankets the table. Now, speaking to many people over the years about this dish, it seems that the whole dish feels great and sensory and immersive, but it's the aroma, the activation of the dry ice that really, and the word I'm using here is what I've been kind of fed back, is that it transports them. How does aroma transport us?
I wish I knew. And I'm not even going to claim to even suggest that there might be a way it does that. I think it probably works on multiple levels. Our previous experience with an odour will always help to frame how it transports us. So the first encounter that you have with something like that will make a difference to what you feel about it. But at the same time, genetically, we're all programmed slightly differently to receive olfactory data.
Sure.
And so we're never, ever going to all respond to something in exactly the same way.
We're not. And okay, so I want to pick up on the genetics thing in a moment. But
Yeah.
one thing that I'm always interested in is that although as individuals, as human beings, we all have, we all live in our own different sensory worlds that are partially genetic, partially cultural. But there are certain sensory aspects that kind of unite us to some degree. So an example I can give with color is that, over 75% of the world's population will relate the color red to sweetness. And that seems to be something that, despite culture, despite your kind of own individual, preconceptions, that everyone kind of understands that red is sweet. Do we have similar universal associations with aroma? And I mean that in the case of something like geosmin, that most people around the world, they can smell that and they'll have some memory that relates to that specific aroma, because is it universal in some way?
I think there's a level to which it's universal if you live somewhere where it at some point rains, because geosmin is largely the smell that you associate with just that moment before rainfall happens. And it's quite often described as the smell of rain. And so with that, yes, you do have something that probably transcends almost every country and culture, because it will be something that you're familiar with. It marks, again, a difference. So if you walk into a doorway or you walk into somewhere and then walk out again, you're going into different sort of like smell environments. And that geosmin smell marks the end of something dry and going into something wet. So it's an indication that something is happening. We're cueing it as human beings as there's change. We're recognizing that through our eyes, through our skin, because we're getting wet, we're seeing it, and we're smelling it. So it's to do with I think that the geosmin smell is largely to do with being outside. And then we transfer it to all different types of environments, like cellars and old houses that are being done up and canals. And so it's sort of like it is embedded in different areas. You're familiar with the term petrichor?
Yes.
And that's essentially it. Geosmin equals almost petrichor.
And so my understanding is that our olfactory system has a direct link with the amygdala, being the kind of emotional center of the brain. And I believe, this is from what I've read at least, is that it's the only sense that has that direct link to the amygdala. Does that make smell one of the most emotional senses that we have?
It has been suggested that that is the case. In the smell is the sense that doesn't go through the frontal cortex in terms of processing, so it goes through the amygdala, and that's where memories and associations are also reside in the brain. So there is that suggestion that smell, memory, association become very closely linked. I'm not a neurologist, nor
No,
somebody
sure.
that understands exactly how physiologically all of that might work. But many people refer to the fact that smell does have those links, and therefore those memories and those moments and that moderation by experience is what's really important about smell.
And there's also, I believe, again, I've come across research that suggests that olfactory stimulation can help with memory and retaining information, which I thought was quite bizarre because I never got taught that at school. No one ever anchored the periodic table to certain aromas. But it's an interesting idea, though, isn't it? That potentially, are we missing a trick with, using our sense of smell in a more functional way like that?
I have read that there was, you could, if you were revising for an exam and you actually had sort of like peppermint while you were revising certain sections, and then you had something else when you were revising, sort of like, say, for an English exam, but you had peppermint for biology, and then you actually put those on your wrist as you walked in. You couldn't be conceived of as cheating because all you were doing was just having sort of like smells associated. I've got no idea whether that is backed up or not, but it's kind of a nice idea.
With GCSEs upon us, I'm sure this is a good little hack for all those students out there who are sweating it out. Yeah. So going back to, you'd mentioned this idea of kind of genetics. And for those who aren't familiar, how does that impact the difference in terms of how we may be smelling an aroma? Are we smelling, if we're both smelling jasmine or hyacinth, are we all smelling exactly the same thing?
It's very doubtful whether we're smelling exactly the same thing. We've got a large amount of sort of like molecules that we will all smell, but there are a number that very interestingly are ones that some people seem to be missing. Some people can't smell blue cheese, other people can't smell violets. Apples is another one, and there's always a fourth one that I forget, which will come back to me at some point.
Okay.
But I just think that's quite an interesting profile in its own, to think about where is violet? Where does violet come up in your world of smelling that actually might be important to you? And I always think at that point of wine tasters, because violets is very much a note in wines. That does that actually preclude you from being a blender or a critic or somebody involved very much in that world if you have a diminished sense of violets as part of your olfactory receptor set?
Well, I mean, that's fascinating because you do have specific jobs, don't you, where people's noses, especially in, I guess, in the world of perfume is where I'm most familiar with it. And even in the world of food, but that's more people's palates. I've heard of, in short, up to £1 million, because they have a very specific blending job and task at hand. So if some people's sense of smell are being insured for £1 million, that puts a lot of value on it in terms of, for the power of what our sense of smell is bringing. I guess in perfumery, it's understandable, but also when it comes to the relationship that we have with food.
It's very much so. And I think that sort of like with the food and drink industry, increasingly you find that blenders of whiskies cannot taste that number of whiskies in a day in order to be able to sort of like signify blends and to figure out what's happening. So their sense of smell is actually how they do their job. If they imbibe that amount, they just fall over at the end of each day and not be able to get up again. So it's incredibly valuable in some industries and recognised as such.
And sorry, I should have actually gotten you to explain right at the beginning for those who are watching that maybe aren't so familiar with how the olfactory system works. So when we talk about flavour, and I talk to a lot about flavour, there's a notion that it's all about salty, bitter, sour, sweet, umami, fatty, metallic, maybe kind of flavours. But then you go on to kind of explain, well, no, that's really looking at your basic tastes, and that's what you perceive in that kind of that oral cavity. What is it that our sense of smell brings to the party?
Our sense of smell has, it brings, when you eat food, then your saliva touches it, it's warm inside your mouth. And some olfactory molecules, we tend to think of a smell as just breathing through our noses and it going through our nostrils. There's also what's known as retronasal. smelling. So that's when the olfactory molecules go up inside your palate and they stay inside your mouth as a result of you having actually taken a mouthful of that food. So that's where you will actually be able to create those sort of like small nuances of difference. So yes, you can always taste sweet. And you can always taste salty, and you will always taste bitter. And increasingly, we've sort of like extended that to umami as well. There's a famous jelly bean test that the jelly beans with lots of different flavors, if you put them in your mouth and you hold your nose, block it off, you taste sweet. And you don't get the nuance of what's actually there until you release it. And if you think about what it's like when you've got a cold, that's when you can't taste food. And that's the importance, and that's how smell contributes to what you're eating as well, and the flavours.
So we do the jelly bean test here at our chef's table, and interestingly enough, I've heard that people have done this thing where they blindfold a participant, block their nose and get them to bite into an onion, and they think they're biting into an apple. But I think the jelly bean test is a slightly more palatable way of putting that idea to the test.
That's mean.
And every time we do the test, people always ask, are these the Harry Potter beans? So, yeah. Right. So in terms of that sense of smell, you were talking about kind of retronasal, which is as we're chewing, we're eating, all these molecules are being passed up through the back of the olfactory system. And then you have obviously everything that we're smelling up front. So the orthonasal. Are we getting exactly the same things orthonasally as we are retronasally?
You know what? Nobody's ever asked me that, and I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I really don't know the answer to that.
And I'm curious about it because I do think that there's an element of once you've mixed those compounds with your saliva, your own personal as well, saliva and your bacteria, there must be somewhat of a difference, right? Because blue cheese does not smell the same way orthonasally as I
think it does.
Perceive it on my palate.
Yeah. I think cheese is actually probably a really good example. If you think of a lot of very sort of, I don't know, some of the rind-based cheeses, I'm thinking of Saint Nectaire, that smells very much like that jasmine. It's got that sort of like vague barnyardy aroma to it. When you actually bite into it, it doesn't always taste like that. And so cheese might be the living example that says orthonasally and retronasally, so through your nostrils or through the back of your palate, you are actually getting a different set of olfactory receptors and a different response.
Yeah. Now, you'd mentioned a moment ago, this kind of piqued my interest, was about this idea of almost... I've always thought as a chef that when we talk about colors, there are ranges, right? There are tones and vibrancies and, Pantones, and there's ways of almost codifying color. You've done some work with looking, I guess, at smell and color associations. What are the smell color associations that we have? Because I've done work looking at color taste associations, but I'd never really thought about smell color associations. What does that look like?
It's quite interesting, and a lot of the work that I come from in this, or that I've done in this field, is based on smell walks. So I take people from different cities out for walks. They smell things, they write down a name for that and a relative intensity and a duration and anything else that comes to mind. And then quite often at the end of that experience, I'll also ask them to then paint what their smell experience was like. And it's done in a small grid, and it's designed to be sort of like as accessible and easy to do as possible, quite often with watercolour pencils or with watercolours. And from that, it starts to sort of like build up correlations about how often the colour of smell is very closely linked to how we see it. So fatty foods are often portrayed as being sort of like yellow colour. Citrus usually comes out as sort of like quite a limey green because it's perceived to be sharper. Oranges come out as orange. And so there is this sort of like this fascinating set, especially with food, that what we see is exactly how we actually depict it. Where it becomes interesting is when you get to things like herbs. So if you don't actually see the herb, but you smell it, then quite often they are described in terms of warm colours. So they will be warm and orange, and they will give that sensation of possibly, I don't know, Mediterranean climates or garrigues or sort of like hillsides in sort of like the Pyrenees. But then when you actually see some of those herbs, they're green.
Sure.
And so you end up with this sort of like dual perspective on herbs. And there are projects out there to be done in terms of smell and colour, not just with relation to food, but also everything else that you find in the city as well.
Yeah. What's fascinating about everything that you're saying is that there's some really good science behind all of this. And just to take a moment to I noticed that your PhD, which fascinated me, was nose first, practices of smell walking and smellscape mapping.
Exactly.
What does that entail? How did you end up doing a PhD in what is, I'm sure for many people, quite a obscure niche kind of area of research?
I ended up doing it thanks to a number of people that were also involved in looking at particularly urban smellscapes. So I had a colleague many years ago when I was from Edinburgh, and she and I presented at the same conference, and her name was Victoria Henshaw, and she had a book on urban smellscapes. And she looked at the map of Edinburgh that I'd done and said, you need to do a PhD in this. And in a moment, that's how our lives are changed. She introduced me to some amazing people. And as a result, I was privileged enough to go to the Royal College of Art in London. And I applied to do visual communication because I was interested in this idea about smell mapping, and could you map smells? And if you could map smells, should you map smells? And why do it? And the School of Visual Communication said, we don't think you're really visual communication. We think you're actually information experience design. And I said, what on earth is that? And they said, well, it's about designing, it's taking information, translating it into design through experience. Okay, that sounds about right. And it was a very niche field, but my research is largely about ways, the elements of smell that can be visually represented, and then how you might go about doing that. So I love talking about smell. My area of expertise is very much in the creation of symbol sets and to represent the smells on maps. We're all familiar with the idea of having a legend or a key on a map. And what I try to do is figure out different ways that enable us to understand what that smell experience might be like through the symbols that we see, very much like a good ordnance survey map would do so.
Fascinating. And you mentioned something really interesting there, which is the why. Why is this important?
By the end of the PhD, I'd come to two conclusions about that. One was it's important because we should never, ever trust what other people tell us, but direct experience of the world is the way that we gain a knowledge of the richness of what is around us. And with that, in a multisensory world, what we should be taking account of is how all of our senses combine in order to give us the rich experiences that we have. There are a lot of applications for smellscape mapping in terms of built environment and what you can do, and how you can actually modify and manipulate that.
Oh, tell me a bit more. I'm curious.
But my own concern is really about understanding the small differences and being able to communicate those to each other as human beings. So my focus is at the small scale human sense of the word. And then if other people choose to use it, then you can actually say, well, okay, if you build something only out of glass and metal, you're not affording it anywhere for the smells to actually linger. They're going to brush off those surfaces and they're not going to be there. And so you won't end up with that historic layered richness of smell that sometimes comes in a material environment.
Sure. And I guess that's interesting in terms of applications within things like workspaces. If you're looking at kind of well-being, if you're looking at, kind of the environment that you're creating. And I'm just thinking nowadays more than ever, people are so much more in tune with their sensory environment, both at work and at home. How can aromas and smell play a role in crafting more positive environments for us to work and live in?
It's an interesting point that you touch on there, because whilst we're very aware of it, what has come with that is also an awareness of when we feel we're being manipulated. So there are brands that have, for a long period of time, used smell as a way of creating an association and a draw for people. But at the same time, the artificial creation of different scents and olfactory molecules has meant that some people say, I don't actually want to smell this particular smell when I walk into my bank, because it's wrong and I haven't chosen to smell that. Outside in the open world, we can move away from scents quite quickly. When we're in enclosed environments, we are much more heightened and knowledgeable now about what we choose to smell and what we don't.
I remember walking into a clothing store in San Sebastian in Spain, and it smelled of bubblegum. And I remember just this feeling that there was something quite incongruent about walking through a men's section in a clothing store and it's smelling of bubblegum. It just didn't kind of seem congruent. How important is congruency with what we smell?
It's a current sort of like, I've got two new areas of sort of like real interest at the moment. And that idea of, is it congruent or not, is one of them. Similarly, I was in a clothing shop in northern Norway in Tromsø, and it smelled of bacon. And it's like, okay, there's something fundamentally wrong here. Is it me, or is it the shop? What's actually going on? And it turned out that it was a larger part of that shop, and it was serving bacon rolls at the same time as serving that population with clothing. It's incongruent smells are lovely because they stop us in our tracks. That moment that I was talking about earlier about actually perceiving smell, and when I was walking down here, was one such moment. I was walking down the street. I wasn't expecting to smell garlic because it was beautiful Mews Street in the slightly falling rain in London in May. And then I could smell garlic, and then something perfumey, and then arc welding. That was the incongruence of where I was, what I was seeing, with something that's just sort of like blindsided me from my nose.
Triggers an awareness,
yes,
and a mindfulness,
yes,
I guess one would say.
Exactly. And I think that, and again, that's sort of like, that's where my work comes back to, is about getting us to be in tune with our human bodies, to experience that environment in the outdoors as far as possible, and just to become more mindful and aware of how we experience the world.
Because there's something about this kind of idea of almost aroma congruencies that I guess I'm interested in as a chef, because when you look at, am I right in thinking it's isovaleric acid that has that kind of Parmesan cheese kind of is one of the main compounds in there, but it's also one of the main compounds in kind of smelly socks.
Yes.
So depending on how you present that aroma to people, if you present it to them and say, well, this is my son's gym socks, they're going to repel away from it. But if you describe this as one of the aromas from, a beautiful piece of artisanal Parmesan, that all of a sudden that takes on a completely different context. So are there bad smelling aromas, or are there just aromas that we have a negative association with? I
think there are aromas that we have a negative association with, either very deliberately through cultural training or because of their place-related significance. So, for example, the smell of fish. If you're in a market and you smell raw fish, you go, yeah, that's absolutely right. It's here. That idea of congruence sort of like matches our expectation. If you are in a park and you smell fish, you are questioning what's around you, what's in the bin, how long since it's been cleaned, and is it a safe environment? So smell is quite integrally involved in human hygiene and human safety. Well,
safety, because I'm just thinking, you're right. When the milk is off, what do you do?
Yeah. you sniff it and then you go, okay, I'm not going to drink that because actually I don't want to stick that into my mouth. I prefer to sniff first and then get rid of it.
So this is then something that, I mean, if anything, we become less and less mindful of, right? Because as a chef, you get trained, and not even specifically, I mean, maybe nowadays more, but back in my day, no one was training you on a sensory level to appreciate food, but you kind of just did it as part of being a chef. In terms of fish is a good example. So visually, you're looking at it, the gills, how red they are, the eyes, how clear they are. So that kind of gives you an indication of freshness. The touch, obviously, the feel of it, how the skin and the scales, is it slimy? Is it quite kind of sleek and smooth? And the firmness, obviously, of the meat. But then aroma and the smell is obviously one of the big ones with fish that kind of is an indication that I think you don't even have to be a trained chef to know if fish or meat or dairy in many cases are off. So is this something that we've just become less aware? We've been doing this for, well, since I guess we were in caves sniffing berries and fruits and things to make sure that they were safe to eat. Is this something that we're just losing touch with as time goes by?
I don't think we have to do it as much for ourselves these days. I think that there's the idea of having sort of like sell by and use by dates on products means that quite often we are removed from that need to, again, trust ourselves. And we can say, well, actually, no, let's believe this. That says sort of like tomorrow's date on it. I best either use it by tomorrow or I'll put it in the bin. And I think there was a call out possibly last year for supermarkets to actually get rid of use by dates. And for a large part of the population, I think that would be a great thing. Of course, there are people that are anosmic for whom that actually might become more problematic. So you do have to take account into different needs.
No, of course. But I do think where that's coming from, that there's a good idea behind it from the sense of reducing food waste, because I do think a lot of people at home, once they see that, even a best before or a use by date, that they take that as gospel, and that they pretty much will, bin something without having smelt, touched, tasted it ahead of throwing it out. So I do think there is something there in terms of re-educating people as to how, well, the sensory relationship that they have with food.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's fundamental. We don't need to throw away the amount of food that we throw away. And you can detect if something's off or not. It is purely about trusting yourself to be able to do that. And eating a small amount of it probably isn't going to harm you. I don't know how true it is, and sort of like from the chef's perspective, you'll be able to tell me. But with curries, my understanding was that curries were actually the spices we used to mask the smell of meat that actually was going off. And so if that's the case, then I guess there's a...
Sure, there's a lot of that in various different cultures where very aromatic spices and dry rubs were used to mask that kind of potential off aroma that you get from food. But they do the same thing. So my father, when he taught me to cook mincemeat in the Middle East, because my father's from Egypt, and in the Middle East they have this whole kind of thing about meat having, there's a specific word for it that we don't have in English, that doesn't translate into a specific word in English, but it basically revolves around something smelling a little off. But it's not off. It can be when, we all know what this aroma is. We just don't necessarily have a word for it in English. But when you open up a pack of meat and you get that meaty smell, and it can smell sometimes a little too meaty or chickeny, it's that. And they have a word for that aroma.
It's like a wet market in the Far East.
Exactly. Yeah. And it has that aroma. And to mask it, they will still, till today, you'll use things like cinnamon. That's always the tip in Middle Eastern cooking, is you put a pinch of cinnamon in there, and that just helps kind of mask some of those kind of, again, not off smells, but those kind of meaty smells.
It's where it becomes really strong, and too strong a meaty smell.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, spices are still very much used in that sense, but definitely in the past, that was a big part of it wasn't just for flavor. It was about also masking some of the kind of off smells.
And then I guess with that, you're also cooking it to the extent that there isn't going to be any bacteria left in it.
Sure.
So what you're doing is you're masking it initially with those aromas and those spices. And then you're saying, okay, now I'm going to make sure this is really well cooked in order that we're safe eating it.
Yeah. Now, talking about safety and our sense of smell outside of food, what have we developed over time that maybe our sense of smell is one of those? Because, I mean, an obvious one would be if you smell burning, right?
Yep.
That you know that the building's on fire or
Yep.
something's on fire,
Yep.
and it's a cue to exit. Is our sense of smell also kind of functioning in other ways that are protecting us?
You know what? I don't know. I mean, I think that it's primarily for what we ingest. But there is, in terms of the airborne smells that come to us from longer distances. So sort of one of the fascinating things in my mind is smells. Some of them you have to be close up to be able to detect them. And then other ones are much wider and much more dispersed and can come from a long way away. And so we deliberately deploy our sense of smell in terms of safety for things like natural gas, which has got mercaptan added to it in order that we can tell if something that is fundamentally toxic to us will then is there in too great a quantity that we should actually move away from it. And I think it was back in 2013, mercaptan is made by a factory, or was then made in a factory in Rouen in northern France. And they had a huge release of it, an accidental release of it. And it came across to the UK in clouds of mercaptan.
Wow.
And people were opening their bedroom windows in South London going, I can smell something really strange. And there was comedy aspects to it as well, with people saying, I thought it was my boyfriend farting. I didn't realise that it was actually something that was coming from outside. But that travelled, 200 plus miles. But that's something that we put in very, very small amounts to warn ourselves of something that we use on an everyday basis that's fundamentally toxic if we ingest it.
So talking about, because that's a very functional aspect of smell, and going back and thinking of another kind of very functional aspect of smell, again, that I guess comes back to relating to food, is how it relates to our appetite. Having spoken to several people who suffer or have suffered with anosmia, one of the effects of this seems to be reduced appetite.
There's an enjoyment principle in there. I worked for a while with some members of the anosmic community, and most of them said that their fundamental enjoyment in eating had disappeared because there was very little to look forward to. And as a result, they were looking for something that was very spicy because that sort of like hits a trigeminal nerve, which actually makes your mouth tingle a bit. So they could get some pleasure from that. And the different charities that work with anosmia were at pains to point out sort of like how you could create recipes that had different textures in them in order to make eating more enjoyable.
Sure.
But absolutely. Sort of like you come back to it and you say, well, is eating so much fun anymore? The pleasure's gone. Reduced appetite probably happens as a result from that.
Well, I'd read some research years ago, and I was never sure whether I'd read this right. And I actually confirmed it with a colleague who works specifically in the area of multisensory flavor perception research. The research had said, and I mentioned this a little while ago, that when people were asked if they had to lose one of their senses, what would it be? And the sense of smell was way up there in first position.
Yeah.
But then correlate that with long-term research that found that people who lose their sense of smell in the long term suffer from greater degrees of depression than those who lose their sense of vision.
Okay, that's interesting.
Well, it kind of makes sense
Yes.
in some ways, because you lose your sense of vision. There's a lot that obviously is going to take adjusting to. But once you've adjusted, there is an adjustment.
Yes. Yeah.
You can adjust into that.
Yeah.
You've lost your sense of sight. So, okay, whether it's watching movies or whether it's mobility
Yeah.
or whether it's, let's say, more of the kind of emotional, nostalgic stuff like seeing a sunset, that there are all these kind of things that maybe visually that we're losing out on, but that we will find ways of living life without that sense. and enjoying life. Whereas with the sense of smell, it seems like that's something that we can't really adapt to in the sense of returning to where our normal happy level is.
I wonder if that's partly to do with the language descriptions that we've got for visual memories. So if you've got a series of visual memories, then we can recreate those through the power of language that we have, or other people can describe the sunset, they can describe the vista that you're looking over, the rest of the environment. Whereas for smell, it's that smells fishy.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
that smells slightly salty. So again, sort of like coming up with the descriptive language, which is one of the more interesting parts of where I work with really ordinary people that walk around cities. Their descriptions for smells conjure things when you put them collectively that no others do. I've just been in Glasgow. I'll give you an example. I've just been in Glasgow doing some research on the Glasgow subway and what the smells of that are, because it's a very distinctive smell and it's very much loved by the Glaswegian community who are in the vicinity of that particular. It's called the Clockwork Orange. It just goes round in a circle. And years ago, somebody described it as smelling like a damp metallic sponge. And so we were up there, we were sort of like doing some smell walks and sort of figuring out, and there were smells associated with it that sort of like came to the fore. So it's sulfuric, but it's slightly eggy, it's still slightly metallic, it's got a geosmin nature to it, but then it's got these other elements like escalator ozone, and there's this combination of a dry warmth along with this damp smell. And so there's this astonishing sort of like a set of very much sensory, just a whole range of descriptors that get pulled together. And somebody that was on the walk went away and made that smell. So they created it with some things that they have in their sort of library of olfactive materials in Glasgow. And she brought it back and sort of like presented it at a conference last week. And somebody in the audience said, "It's really lovely, but it doesn't invoke in me any of the feeling of being in the subway. I like the smell, it might represent it, but I'm looking at it from much more of a multisensory experience about I need that blast of air in order for that smell to actually have meaning."
Yeah.
So that's when we start to look at smells not just as being sort of like single unitary objects, but actually they are part of a far greater environment that they exist in.
As you said, there's that kind of emotional link there, right, with these aromas, that particular aroma of the Glasgow subway or underground being familiar to people, but evoking a certain kind of emotion or feeling. But maybe it needs more context kind of around that to truly deliver that full experience. The other, I guess, aspect with anosmia that's, I think, a part of why it might be more difficult to deal with in the long term than, let's say, suffering from a visual impairment in some way is that so many of our festivities and celebrations revolve around food.
Yeah.
So many meaningful social interactions revolve around food that you kind of think, yeah, it would be pretty difficult around, I don't know, Diwali or Eid or Christmas or birthdays if everyone's enjoying this large piece of cake and you're just not getting the cherry and the dark chocolate and the nuanced appreciation, or even just going out with colleagues for a glass of wine after work.
I think you're onto something there. It's almost like it's a reminder of what you're missing, rather than you being able to actually participate in it in any meaningful way. And one of the strategies that we were using when we were doing sort of like some work with the anosmic community was to do these things called paired smell walks, where somebody would walk with somebody, so a sniffer, an ordinary smeller and an anosmic smeller, and they would use that opportunity to say, right, I'm stopping here because, and then actually describing what it was that they were smelling in order to be able to sort of like bring those elements back to them again and to try and reconjure that almost smell imagination and those smell memories that they had previously.
So talking about how rich smell is and how we're moving at a hurtling speed towards kind of this digital existence. What does that mean for our sense of smell, and how do we incorporate aroma being this really kind of important emotional, nostalgic sense that we have? At the moment, I see very few digital technologies that are looking to embrace smell. I mean, we've all heard about smell-o-vision. I think I've heard about that since I was a kid, this idea of, watching a cooking show and smelling the lovely aromas of the chef's creations. But given that we really are in a much more digital age where everyone that we're meeting and that lack of human touch, I think people see has an effect in maybe the way they engage and interact with one another. But how does smell factor into this? What do we need to do to kind of ensure that we don't lose out on that rich sensory information that we're getting?
I think there's some very interesting work that's going on at the moment, especially within the gaming industry, about how you can actually bring the smell into games. And then you're looking at delivery mechanisms and how sort of like virtual reality can have set triggers up, and then you can have manufactured synthetic odors that go to sort of like relate to the gaming action that you've got going on. And I was working last year with a theatre company to produce smells for the theatre to actually link with a key character or to link with a moment in the action. There are ways of engaging the sense of smell in that digital realm. Again, I mean, it's one of those areas that I would prefer that we engage our digital worlds and we have our analog worlds, and we enjoy both of them for what they can give, and we don't try to recreate one in the other purely because we can. But I recognise that there are some times where actually it adds something to that experience. And I think probably with that in mind, the one important thing that I'd add in there is that we smell very little. We don't, when we're looking around us, we're constantly looking at the room, we're looking at what people are wearing, we're looking at people's faces. When you're smelling, a smell happens one breath at a time almost. And so we're processing that information, or we slow that processing down by how we actually sniff. And so when you're in a virtual environment like a game, then you move around very quickly, but we can't process smell that quickly. So it's what we discovered with the theatre experience was to include a smell, and we only used natural ingredients in the smells that were diffused throughout the theatre, giving them a chance to disperse, and then adding in something else again gave it moments of poignancy and it gave it real meaning. So you thought very carefully about when to introduce those smells.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I guess one of the issues that you have there, and we've had this at our own dining experiences, where the worst thing is where aromas overlap.
Yes.
And then you end up with this kind of strangely incongruent truffle and vanilla or caramel aroma lingering in the air that doesn't quite mesh.
It's kind of like plasticine when you get all the colours together. I reckon
That's a great analogy, yeah.
I reckon you get olfactory brown.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens to it. And it becomes, I mean, I've been in situations where I've taken large numbers of different smells into classrooms, some of them synthetic, some of them natural. And people have actually said, I need to get out of here, I've got a headache, because it is just too intense. And so keeping in our minds that we need to actually give that space. Smell is airborne deliberately in terms of the human experience of it. Giving it that space to be able to disperse before we re-engage it is really important.
Just out of curiosity, before I do kind of bring this to an end, but so what would constitute an aromatic palate cleanser then?
The best one is the smell of our own bodies.
So that's why
that's why you do the sniffing your own skin, because that's actually the aromatic palate cleanser. It was always described when I first started this work. Everybody said, "Oh, you need to smell coffee beans,"
and that's what I heard. Yeah,
And I think that was used inside, I don't know, some of the boutiques in order to really contrast with the perfumes. And then sort of like quite early on, sort of like I was told by several different people in different communities that actually the best thing that you can smell to do an olfactory reset is your own skin. And that then gives you the capacity to be able to then restart.
You've just inspired me to think of how we can include that into our dining experience.
Good.
Yeah, maybe smell
That'd
the
be
person
brilliant.
next to you. No, I'm joking. So tell me, Kate, what are you working on at the moment? What's cooking?
The exciting things at the moment is we're just at the end of this Glasgow subway project. So there's there's a new visual map out for that, which is really interesting in terms of just the geology and the sort of like possible contributors to the Glasgow subway smell. And then over this next year, I'm putting together a smellscape atlas of the world, which is going to be published by Orion Books, and that will be out sometime in 2025. So I'm really excited about that.
Well, you saw my book collection. That's one that's ripe for sitting on that shelf. Oh, wonderful! And where are you mapping? What's the?
Well, it's going to be interesting.
Is it specific cities around the world, or is it?
I think it's sort of like, it's lucky cities around the world. So
Okay.
it's places that I've been or I'm going to in the sort of like the near future. So
Okay.
everywhere that I've been going, I've been recording and getting smell walkers involved to record places. I'm just back from Japan. That was fascinating.
Oh,
And that's a
wow.
really different olfactory culture because a lot of the food comes very much plastic wrapped. So you've got this strange sense of being surrounded by these incredible visuals, but a complete absence of smell. So Japan is incredibly, it's non-fragrant, but it has listed 100 sites of special fragrance interest. So I was visiting some of those to actually start thinking about how to put those onto a map as well.
Oh, wow.
And then there's going to be a whole load of different places, from Tallinn in Estonia to another researcher did some work in Ecuador, and she's given me permission to use her findings so that I can then map those as well. So it's going to be fascinating. It's going to try and cover the continents, and then there'll obviously be gaps that I hope other people can fill.
And I have to ask this question now. Where is your favorite smellscape of a city? Where's your favorite, not favorite city in terms of where you enjoy in the architecture, but your favorite smellscape?
I would probably say it rests between two, and these were the two that were in my PhD, and it's maybe because of that, because I know them so well. One was Kyiv in Ukraine, because I recognised now it was an uncanny privilege to have been there,
Yeah.
but it was winter. It was an impromptu smell walk that resulted in really thinking about the temporalities of the smellscape, how long those smells last for, whether they've come through time or whether they're changing over time. And the other one was Singapore. And I think purely because it was my first visit to Asia. And I think your first of anything actually really marks it down as being quite special and quite unique.
Amazing. So before we go, I do have a little something for you. So everyone who joins us on the podcast, I'm fascinated by taking ideas and concepts and seeing how that can in some way be translated into a dish. I guess that's because that's what I do for a living. Now, for each guest, we design a dish that is based on their work and is inspired by their work and their character. And for you, we have developed our edible UK map made of sustainable British ingredients, mapping out where they're located. So similar to how you smell map, this is us taste mapping.
That is absolutely stunning. I love it. Thank you very much indeed.
You're most welcome. Look, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us. Your work is fascinating. Where can people find out more?
Sensorymaps.com is my website. So sensory maps, and that's it. You can
They've
see
got
all of those images and those visuals on there, and there's contact details as well.
Yeah, you've got wonderful showcases of all the research that you've done there. So for anyone interested, that is definitely the place to go. And to look out for your book.
To look out for my book, and also to contact me if you've got some interesting smells in your city. I would always love to hear from you. There's always a chance of doing some research and some work together.
Well,
there's only one of me, and I would love to collect everybody else's smells.
Wonderful. Well, look, I've got a hell of an odor coming out of my son's room, but I don't think you want to be smell mapping that. So yeah,
maybe not today.
Hopefully people will come up with better suggestions than that.
That's great. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us.
Cheers.